The 2015 Intergenerational report presents what could happen to Australia over the next 40 years based on a detailed analysis of recent trends and existing policy settings. The report is broken up into a number of sections which considers different aspects of the outlook: Australia's population, our labour force, the economy, the budget, the environment, and what governments can do to address the challenges of the next 40 years, finishing in 2055. It projects that Australia's population will grow at 1.3% per year, which is slightly below the average growth rate of the past 40 years. And if this were to occur, the population of Australia would reach nearly 40 million by the year 2054-55. That is up from nearly 24 million today. What the IGR fails to consider is the increasing influence that Islam has in Australia. Some 40 years ago, back in 1971, there were just 22,000 Muslims in Australia. That figure amounted to 0.2%. The figure has increased fairly rapidly until in the census of 2011, there were 476,300 people in Australia who identified as Muslim. That was in 2011 and it's now 2015. And you can reasonably project the increase to around about 500,000 or more Muslim people in Australia right now. If you project that growth along the same lines as the IGR does for the general population, that 500,000 today will increase over 10 times in the next 40 years as well, and will go from 2% to 20% of the population. The IGR doesn't address this at all, not even a passing mention on the economic effect that this may have over the next 40 years. There are other issues which affect the gross 20% because history shows that Islamic populations tend to concentrate. Already in our 2011 census, 15% of the population in the suburb of Hume were Muslim. That's more than 6 times the national average. And in the New South Wales suburbs of Bankstown, 26.2% were Muslim, and in Auburn, 42%. So it's not as if that in 2055, the 20% of Muslims in Australia will be spread equally across the country. They will almost certainly be concentrated in populations which meet or exceed that 40 to 50% that are in Auburn already, and will tend to reflect what is happening in Europe and London, that is, isolationist enclaves of Islamic populations in Australia. In 2005, the Australian government under Prime Minister John Howard convened the Muslim Community Reference Group for advice on how best to respond to the threat of homegrown terrorism. The IGR doesn't recognise or address any need or budget to respond to this threat. The IGR does deal in depth with Australia's female participation rate in the workforce and how that might be developed. Female employment rate is projected to continue increasing, following on from strong growth over the last 40 years, where in 1974-75 only 46% of women aged 15 to 64 had a job. Today around 66% of women do so. It's projected to increase to around about 70% in the 40-year span of the IGR. The IGR fails to address the needs of Australian women who are strongly under the controlling influence of the Islamists. Australian Islamic enclaves are already developing. There were 250 cases of underage marriage in Melbourne in 24 months. There are at least 60 child wives living in southwestern Sydney alone. 150 women a week most of whom come from communities where arranged marriage are practiced, and go into the Women's Immigration Legal Advice Centre seeking advice with respect to their arranged marriages or domestic abuse or how they can escape. Of course, it's impossible for them mostly to escape because their mothers, fathers and brothers and uncles would kill them. They are kept prisoners, locked in their husbands' homes, and they're only allowed out if their mothers-in-law go with them, so they can rarely or ever seek help. This sort of forced marriage in Australia is a breach of human rights, and it is reported in reputable Australian news media. The IGR addresses future social security benefits needs in some detail. It talks about family tax benefits, childcare benefits, childcare rebates and so on. It talks about education and training spending, as well as higher education needs. Now, I don't say that members of the Australian Islamic community have a greater draw on social security benefits than other sectors of our population. I do know that such allegations are rampant in the United Kingdom and Europe, where it is said to be an Islamic strategy to weaken the host countries' economies by drawing on social securities and failing to contribute. I do wonder why such economic issues are not addressed when the Islamic community in Australia will be up to 20% of our general population in the life of the 40-year report. In 2013, there was an Australian Senate inquiry into migration and multiculturalism in Australia. It was held by the Parliamentary Joint Standing Committee on Migration, and I referred to their report in March 2013. It was reported in 2013 that the effectiveness of multicultural policy was being called into question. It was being submitted that there were people here in Australia already who posed a challenge to the conservative forces in Australia, because they were Islamic peoples whose values may well be out of step with the mainstream Australia. And at that time, in 2013, 1 in 4 Australians were reported to be uncomfortable with Islam, and this was before Martin's Place or Charlie Hebdo. In that same report, the Australian Federation of Islamic Councils advised that Islam advocates for legal pluralism and accepts all customs of the land, as long as they do not contravene the principles of Sharia. This principle was confirmed as a key by the Centre for Islamic Studies and Civilization, which also made a submission to the Senate Committee. In Australia, the percentage of those who are Islam is rising. A number of their significant representatives are prepared to give evidence to an Australian Senate inquiry that Sharia should take precedence over Australian law. I question why the IGR has not addressed this as an economic impact issue. It is going to be necessary to change and adapt Islam to Australian society. Islamification starts slowly and relies on tolerant, politically correct and culturally diverse societies which agree to agitation for religious rights for Muslims. This seems fair enough. Only then do other components of Sharia creep in. That is why in countries such as Australia, which has 2%, Canada 1.9%, China 1.8%, Italy 1.5%, Norway 1.8%, and United States under 1%. Where there are fewer than 2% in a particular country, Muslims are generally regarded as mostly peace-loving and a minority, not as a threat to other citizens. But when they rise above 2% towards 5% of the population, they start to target and convert other minority groups. This seems so in Germany, 3.7%, United Kingdom, 2.7%, Spain, 4%, Thailand, 4.6%. There's a sliding scale where they start to target dissenters, prison populations and disaffected groups to join them, so that when they reach 5%, they begin to exert an excessive influence compared to their percentage of population, pushing for laws that enforce halal food, pressuring supermarket chains to provide halal food, together with threats for failure to comply. We see this in France, which is now 8%, Philippines 5%, Sweden, which is 5%, Switzerland 4.3%, the Netherlands 5.5%, Trinidad and Tobago 5.8%. The Muslims there pressure to allow themselves to rule in their own enclaves under Sharia. These 100% Sharia areas already exist in Paris and Britain, where no national police enter and no national courts conduct business, no national schools exist, and no non-Muslim religious facilities exist. The children learn only the Quran. Associating with non-Muslims means death, and Muslim religious leaders exert more power than the state. When the population of Muslims approaches 10% of the country's population, they tend to increase their lawlessness in order to complain. Non-Muslim statements or resistance results in uprisings, threats, violence, such as Charlie Hebdo. These events tend to daily occurrences as the population increases. Guyana, where it is 10%, India, where it is 13.4%, Israel 16%, Kenya 10%, Russia 15%. When the Islamic population reaches 20% or more, there will be rioting for next to no reason, the burning of churches and synagogues. If the rate of Islamification of Australia for the last 40 years continues for the next 40 years, that is the life of the IGR report, Australia will be 20% Islamic by 2055. No economic aspect of this has been considered in the IGR. In January of this year, 2015, the Australian government had a review of Australia's counter-terrorism machinery. The review identified, quote, "There are an increasing number of potential terrorists, supporters and sympathisers in our community. There is now an intergenerational dimension with the families of known terrorists increasingly radicalised and involved. We need to acknowledge that we have entered a new long-term paradigm of heightened terrorism threat with a much more significant homegrown element." Now, while the review identifies potential terrorists in our Australian community, the homegrown element, it doesn't really recognise comparable overseas experiences such as Canada and the United Kingdom in particular, which are estimated to be some 10 to 15 years further down the path of Islamisation than Australia is. But no economic aspect of this has been considered in the IGR. In the words of Professor Julia Sumner Miller, why is that so?